Two dogs lie snuggled together, moments away from being put down, their fate seemingly sealed. But as the vet prepares for their final moments, she notices something buried in one of their coats that makes her scream in terror. What had these innocent animals been through? And how could one discovery unravel a web of danger and deceit? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sun cast gentle shadows across Grace Fletcher's carefully tended garden beds. Her weathered hands moved with practiced ease among the vegetables and herbs, pulling tiny weeds from between the rows of tomato plants. The familiar scent of basil and fresh earth filled her nose as she worked, finding peace in the simple routine she'd maintained since retiring from the library 3 years ago. "Grace! Oh, Grace!" The call interrupted her thoughts. Looking up, she saw Karen Whitmore hurrying across the lawn that separated their houses, her usually neat brown hair disheveled and her face pinched with worry. "Is everything all right?" Grace asked, slowly straightening up and brushing dirt from her gardening apron. Karen shook her head, catching her breath. "We're in a terrible situation at the shelter. We've had 3 different hoarding cases this month, and now we're completely overwhelmed. I hate to ask, but we desperately need volunteers." Grace hesitated, twisting her gardening gloves in her hands. Her quiet days had a comfortable pattern: gardening in the morning, reading in her sunny alcove in the afternoon, maybe some light housework in between. The thought of disrupting that routine made her uneasy. "I know it's a lot to ask," Karen added softly, "but even a few hours would help." Something in Karen's pleading tone touched Grace's heart. "Well, I suppose I could spare some time," she found herself saying. At the shelter that afternoon, the cacophony of barking and meowing overwhelmed Grace's senses. Karen led her through narrow corridors until they stopped at a kennel in the back. Inside, 2 dogs huddled together in the corner, one black, one brown, both terribly thin with patches of fur missing. "This is Bella and Bruno," Karen explained quietly. "They were found chained up behind an abandoned house last week. We've tried our best, but—" Her voice trailed off. Grace moved closer to the cage, and her heart clenched at the sight. Despite their obvious suffering, there was something deeply touching about the way the dogs pressed against each other, offering comfort in their shared misery. The brown dog, Bella, lifted her head slightly, revealing soulful eyes that seemed to look straight into Grace's heart. "We're just too full, and their medical needs are extensive," Karen continued, her voice heavy. "The committee made the decision this morning. They're scheduled for tomorrow evening." Grace's hand flew to her mouth. "You mean—" Karen nodded sadly. Would you be willing to sit with them? No one should be alone at the end, and I have to be at another shelter tomorrow." Grace stared at the dogs, watching as Bruno gently nuzzled Bella's neck. The gesture was so tender, so full of love despite everything they'd endured. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll stay with them." As the sun began to set, Grace gathered her belongings to head home. Each step felt heavier than the last as she thought about tomorrow's task. In her mind's eye, she kept seeing those trusting eyes, wondering what cruel twists of fate had brought these gentle creatures to such a tragic end. The morning light barely penetrated Grace's kitchen window as she moved about with deliberate care, gathering items for her difficult task ahead. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded a soft, well-worn fleece blanket, the one that usually draped across her reading chair. Into a canvas tote bag, she placed some dog treats she'd purchased the night before, along with her worn copy of Little Women, its pages dog-eared from countless readings. "Just something comforting," she murmured to herself, touching the book's familiar spine. The weight of what lay ahead pressed heavily on her heart. At the shelter, The morning staff led her quietly to Bella and Bruno's kennel. The two dogs lifted their heads as she approached, Bella's tail offering a tentative wag. Grace settled herself on the clean concrete floor, spreading the blanket beside her. "Come here, sweethearts," she called softly. After some gentle coaxing, both dogs crept closer. Bruno, the black one, stayed partially behind Bella, as if using her for protection. Grace began reading aloud, her gentle voice filling the small space. Gradually, the dogs relaxed, their bodies pressing against her legs. As Grace stroked Bella's patchy fur, her fingers caught on something unusual, a hard lump beneath the matted coat near the dog's shoulder. "What's this?" she wondered aloud, gently probing the area. Bella didn't flinch or show any sign of pain, but Grace's concern grew. "Dr. McAllister?" she called out, knowing the shelter's veterinarian was doing morning rounds. "Could you take a look at something?" The vet, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and graying hair at her temples, entered the kennel. She knelt beside Grace, running practiced hands over the spot Grace indicated. Her expression turned serious as she felt the lump. "This isn't right," Dr. McAllister muttered, reaching for the medical scissors she carried in her coat pocket. With careful precision, she trimmed away the matted fur, revealing something that made both women gasp: a small glass vial, deliberately wrapped in waterproof tape and secured in Bella's coat. Dr. McAllister's face paled as she examined the vial's contents. "This is morphine," she said, her voice tight with concern. "Someone deliberately hid this in her fur." She stood quickly, pulling out her phone. "I need to call the police. This could be connected to something much bigger." Within 30 minutes, Detective Michael Walker strode through the shelter's doors, his presence commanding attention from staff and volunteers alike. The atmosphere grew tense as he approached the kennel area, his notebook already in hand. Grace sat protectively beside Bella and Bruno, who sensed the change in mood and pressed closer to her. Looking at their trusting faces, she felt a fierce surge of determination. Whatever these dogs had been through, whatever they had seen, she knew she couldn't let them down now. Detective Walker stood in the shelter's examination room, his weathered face serious as he studied the small vial in his gloved hands. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows across his features as he turned to Dr. McAllister. "And you're certain about the contents?" he asked, his voice steady and professional. Dr. McAllister nodded firmly. "Yes, I recognized it immediately. It's definitely morphine, the type we use here in medical settings." The detective made careful notes before turning his attention to Grace, who sat quietly in a chair near the corner, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mrs. Fletcher, can you walk me through exactly how you found this?" Grace described the discovery in detail, her voice growing stronger as she spoke about the dogs. "I was just trying to comfort them. They've been through so much already." "Unfortunately, this suggests they've been through even more than we initially thought," Detective Walker said, carefully placing the vial in an evidence bag. "Based on what I'm seeing, these dogs were likely used as drug mules. We'll need to take them into police custody for further investigation." Grace stood up quickly, her heart racing. "No, you can't. They're victims here, not criminals. Look at them. They're terrified and traumatized. They need care and stability, not more stress." The detective's expression softened slightly as he glanced at Bella and Bruno, who huddled together in the corner of the examination room. Bella stood slightly in front of Bruno, as always protecting her more timid companion. "These dogs could be key evidence in what might be a significant drug trafficking case," Detective Walker explained. "We need to ensure they're secure and available for the investigation." "Then let me take care of them," Grace pleaded, her voice firm despite her trembling hands. "I'm retired, I have a fenced yard, and I can watch them constantly. They'll be safe with me, and you'll know exactly where they are." Dr. McAllister stepped forward. "I can vouch for Grace. She's responsible and caring. The dogs have already formed a bond with her. After several long moments, Detective Walker sighed. All right, Mrs. Fletcher. They can stay with you temporarily, but I'll need your full contact information, and you must agree to bring them in if we need them for the investigation. Grace nodded eagerly, relief flooding through her. Within an hour, she had signed the necessary paperwork and was leading Bella and Bruno to her car. The dogs seemed hesitant at first, but followed her trustingly. At home, Grace set up beds in her living room and filled water bowls. She prepared a simple meal of kibble that Dr. McAllister had provided, carefully measuring out the portions for their delicate stomachs. Bella and Bruno ate slowly, still staying close to each other. As evening settled in, Grace watched the dogs drift off to sleep on their new beds. Their bodies finally relaxed, though Bruno still pressed close to Bella's side. Questions swirled in Grace's mind about what these innocent creatures had endured and who could have used them so cruelly. Grace carefully arranged thick blankets in the corner of her living room, creating a cozy nest for Bella and Bruno. The soft lamplight cast a warm glow as she watched them explore their new surroundings, their paws padding tentatively across her carpet. Bruno stayed close to Bella's side, as always seeking comfort from his companion. As she helped them settle onto the blankets, Grace noticed the marks that marred their bodies. Beneath their matted fur, old scars told silent stories of cruelty. A particularly prominent scar ran along Bruno's front leg, while Bella's back showed evidence of what looked like burn marks. Grace's heart ached at the sight. "You're safe now," she whispered, gently stroking Bella's head. The dog leaned into her touch, dark eyes full of trust. Later that evening, as Grace sat reading in her armchair, a strange sound caught her attention. It was the low rumble of an engine, idling too long to be someone simply passing by. She moved carefully to her window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. Through the darkness, she could make out the shadowy outline of a car across the street, its headlights off, but engine running. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the porch light switch. The moment the light flooded her front yard, the car's engine revved and it pulled away, disappearing into the night. Grace's heart pounded as she watched the taillights fade into the distance. Both dogs had lifted their heads, alert to her tension. Bella let out a low whine, and Bruno pressed closer to her side. Grace moved away from the window, her mind racing. Was it just a coincidence, or was someone watching her house because of the dogs? The discovery of the morphine vial suddenly felt more ominous. These dogs had come from somewhere, had been used by someone, and that someone might be looking for them. She couldn't ignore the connection. After making sure all her doors and windows were securely locked, Grace sat down at her kitchen table with a notepad. She needed to start piecing together what she knew. Tomorrow, she would visit the shelter again and look through their intake records. There had to be some clue about where Bella and Bruno had come from. The dogs had drifted back to sleep on their blankets, but Grace remained vigilant. She settled into her armchair near their corner, drawing comfort from their peaceful breathing even as her eyes kept drifting to the window. The street outside was empty now, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Her quiet life had suddenly become complicated, but looking at the sleeping dogs, she knew she wouldn't have it any other way. They needed her, and she would protect them. The morning sun filtered through Grace's kitchen window as she measured out dog food into 2 bowls. She had barely slept, getting up several times during the night to check the street outside. Bella and Bruno watched her intently from their corner, their tails wagging with growing confidence. "Here you go, sweethearts," Grace said, placing the bowls down carefully. She noticed how Bruno no longer flinched when she moved near him, and Bella had started making eye contact more frequently. These small changes warmed her heart despite her exhaustion. After finishing her own breakfast of toast and coffee, Grace gathered her purse and car keys. The dogs looked up anxiously as she prepared to leave, and she bent down to reassure them. "I'll be back soon. You're safe here." She made sure they had fresh water and their blankets were arranged comfortably before heading out. The animal shelter was quiet when Grace arrived, with only a few early morning volunteers going about their tasks. Karen was in the office, sorting through paperwork when Grace knocked on the doorframe. "Grace, how are they doing?" Karen's face brightened at seeing her friend. "They're settling in, but Karen, I need to know more about where they came from. Do you have any records from when they were found?" Karen pulled out a thin file folder. "There's not much here, I'm afraid. They were picked up near the old Riverside Apartments complex, you know, that abandoned building on Mason Street." Grace nodded, pulling up a chair as Karen spread out the few documents they had. "The interesting thing is," Karen continued, "when our rescue team found them, they wouldn't leave the area. Usually, strays are eager to come with us when we offer food. But these two," she shook her head, "they kept trying to go back to the building. It took hours to finally get them into the van." Grace leaned forward, studying the intake forms. "Was there anything else unusual?" "Well, they were clearly traumatized, but they seemed to be protecting something. We searched the area, but never found what it might have been." Karen tapped her fingers thoughtfully on the desk. "The complex has been empty for years, but there's evidence people have been squatting there." Grace made notes of the address and details from the forms, her mind already forming a plan. After thanking Karen, she drove to the Riverside Apartments, parking her car across the street from the dilapidated building. The 3-story complex was a sorry sight, with plywood covering most windows and graffiti marking the walls. Grace approached cautiously, noting the worn paths through the overgrown grass. Near the main entrance, she found signs of recent activity: scattered dog toys, torn blankets that might have served as beds, and empty food containers. Someone had been living here, possibly with Bella and Bruno. A cold feeling settled in her stomach as she surveyed the scene. The evidence suggested the dogs hadn't been alone, but who had been caring for them? And what connection did they have to the morphine vial? Grace knew she needed more information before investigating further. Grace sat at her kitchen table, a fresh notepad before her, while Bella and Bruno dozed nearby on their blankets. The evening light cast long shadows across the room as she began writing down everything she knew. Her neat librarian's handwriting filled the page with careful observations. The morphine vial topped her list, followed by detailed descriptions of the dog's physical conditions: the scars on Bruno's left flank, the way Bella favored her right front paw. She sketched a rough layout of the abandoned apartment complex, marking where she'd found the scattered items. The dog toys had been well worn, but not cheap, suggesting someone who cared enough to buy good quality items despite limited means. "What happened to you two?" she murmured, glancing at the sleeping dogs. Bruno's ear twitched in response, but he didn't wake. The next morning, Grace made her way to the police precinct, clutching her notes. Detective Walker's office was small and cluttered, with case files stacked on every available surface. He looked up from his computer with barely concealed impatience as she entered. "Mrs. Fletcher, what can I do for you?" His tone suggested he'd rather be doing anything else. Grace pulled out her notepad. "I visited the location where the dogs were found," she began, describing the scene at the apartment complex. Walker's expression remained neutral, but she noticed his attention sharpen when she mentioned the regular signs of habitation. After she finished, Walker leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. Finally, he sighed and pulled a file from one of the stacks. "The address you visited?" It was previously rented by a woman named Lila Grant. He opened the file, revealing a photo of a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a determined expression. She was a nurse at Memorial Hospital until 2 years ago. Got fired after being accused of stealing narcotics from the pharmacy. Grace leaned forward, studying the photograph. What happened to her? Disappeared right after she was terminated. Left everything behind. Her apartment, her car, all of it. Walker's tone grew stern. Mrs. Fletcher, I understand you want to help these dogs, but this could be connected to something bigger. The morphine vial, the location. It's not a coincidence. But what if she was innocent? Grace pressed. What if there's more to the story? Walker closed the file firmly. This is an active investigation. I appreciate your concern, but please, leave this to the professionals. Grace left the precinct, her mind whirling with questions about Lila Grant. The woman in the photograph hadn't looked like someone who would steal drugs or abandon animals. There had to be more to the story. As she walked to her car, Grace began mentally listing places where she might find information about Lila's past. The morning sun cast long shadows across Grace's front yard as she stepped out to collect her mail, still wearing her pale blue robe. Her slippers made soft shuffling sounds against the concrete path. Bella and Bruno watched attentively from the living room window, their breath fogging the glass. The mailbox door hung open, unusual for this early hour. Grace's heart skipped a beat as she noticed a plain white piece of paper inside, folded once and placed deliberately on top of yesterday's unopened catalogs. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. 4 words typed in stark black letters. Stop asking questions. The paper quivered in her unsteady hands. Grace scanned the quiet street, her neck prickling with unease. The neighboring houses stood peaceful and still. Mrs. Henderson's cat lounged on a nearby fence, and somewhere a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically. Everything looked normal, yet somehow wrong. Back inside, Grace double-checked every lock, testing doorknobs and window latches twice. Bella pressed against her leg, while Bruno watched from his blanket, both dogs seeming to sense her distress. She considered calling Detective Walker, but remembered his dismissive attitude. The phone sat heavy in her hand before she set it back down without dialing. Throughout the day, Grace stayed close to the dogs, finding comfort in their presence. Bella's gentle nudges and Bruno's watchful eyes helped calm her racing thoughts. She prepared their meals, brushed their slowly improving coats, and tried to maintain a sense of normalcy despite her underlying anxiety. That night, Grace tossed and turned in her bed. When sleep finally came, it brought vivid dreams. A young woman's voice echoed through darkness, calling out desperately, "Please, someone has to know the truth." The voice seemed to bounce off invisible walls, growing fainter with each echo. Grace recognized the determination she'd seen in Lila's photograph, now mixed with fear and urgency. She woke with a start, her heart pounding. Bella and Bruno stood alert beside her bed, their eyes reflecting the dim light from her bedside clock. The dream clung to her consciousness, Lila's voice still ringing in her ears. Though her hands still shook slightly when she thought of the threatening note, Grace felt a deeper certainty taking root. Someone had tried to silence Lila, and now they were trying to silence her. But as Grace looked at the 2 dogs who had somehow found their way to her, she knew she couldn't stop. Whatever truth lay hidden in their past, it was crying out to be discovered. Despite her fear, Grace knew she would continue searching for answers. The morning sunlight streamed through Grace's kitchen window as she watched Bella and Bruno playing with their toys. Her heart warmed at how much more relaxed they had become in just a few days. Bella had taken particular interest in an old plush rabbit she must have brought from the shelter, carrying it everywhere and guarding it carefully. As Grace prepared their breakfast, she noticed Bella chewing intently on the toy, more focused than usual. Something about the dog's behavior caught her attention. When she reached down to check the worn rabbit, she felt something hard beneath the matted fabric. "What have you got there, girl?" Grace asked softly, gently taking the toy from Bella, who released it without protest. The stuffed rabbit was threadbare, its once pink fur now a dingy gray. As she turned it over in her hands, she could definitely feel something solid inside. Grace retrieved her sewing scissors from the kitchen drawer. With careful snips, she opened a seam along the rabbit's back. Reaching inside, her fingers touched something wrapped in plastic. She pulled out a small package about the size of her thumb, sealed tightly in clear wrap. Her hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it. A single key fell into her palm, its brass surface dulled with age. It looked like a standard door key, nothing remarkable about it. Yet Grace felt her pulse quicken. Could this be connected to Lila somehow? Settling at her computer, Grace spent the next hour searching online for information about different types of keys and locks. The key appeared to be for a regular door lock, possibly from an older building based on its style. But without more context, she couldn't narrow down its purpose. Her thoughts kept returning to the abandoned apartment complex where Bella and Bruno had been found. The key's aged appearance matched the building's deteriorated state. Perhaps it would fit one of the locks there. Grace glanced at the clock. Early afternoon. There would still be plenty of daylight for exploring. She decided to take Bella and Bruno with her, hoping their familiarity with the place might help. They seemed eager for the outing, their tails wagging as she gathered their leashes. At the complex, Grace approached cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of other visitors. The building loomed before them, its windows dark and uninviting. She tried the key in several accessible locks, the main entrance, a side door, even a rusty mailbox, but none worked. Bella and Bruno watched patiently as she moved from door to door, but the key refused to find its match. Disappointment settled over Grace as she realized this trip wouldn't provide the answers she sought. Still, she carefully tucked the key into her pocket, determined to keep it safe. Whatever it opened, she felt certain it was important. Bella gave a soft bark beside her, drawing Grace's attention, but revealed nothing more about the mystery they were slowly uncovering. The morning sun cast long shadows across Grace's kitchen table as she settled in with her laptop and a cup of tea. Bella and Bruno dozed nearby on their blankets, their gentle breathing a soothing backdrop to her research. Grace's fingers moved deliberately across the keyboard as she typed Lila Grant Nurse into the search bar. Several articles from the local newspaper's archive appeared. Grace clicked through them, absorbing the details of Lila's career. She had worked at Memorial Hospital for 8 years, earning praise for her dedication to patient care. But everything changed 2 years ago, when she was accused of stealing narcotics from the hospital pharmacy. "This doesn't add up," Grace muttered, making notes in her notebook. The timeline of events seemed rushed. Accusation, dismissal, and disappearance all within a matter of weeks. Something about it nagged at her instincts. Later that morning, Grace drove to Memorial Hospital. The massive brick building loomed ahead, its windows reflecting the late morning light. She smoothed her cardigan and walked through the automatic doors, trying to project the air of a curious retiree. In the lobby, she noticed an older nurse organizing files at the reception desk. The woman's name tag read Doris. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and laugh lines creased the corners of her eyes. "Excuse me," Grace said, approaching the desk. "I'm thinking about volunteering here. I'd love to hear about the hospital's history." Doris looked up, her expression warm but guarded. "Of course, dear. I've been here 20 years myself." Grace carefully steered their conversation toward the nursing staff, eventually mentioning Lila's name. Doris's smile faltered slightly. "Lila Grant. Doris said quietly, glancing around. "She was one of our best nurses. Such a shame what happened." Grace leaned in closer. "Was she really stealing drugs?" Doris's eyes darted to the security camera in the corner. She lowered her voice. Lila was brave, too brave sometimes. She noticed discrepancies in the pharmacy inventory and started asking questions. But when she took her concerns to Dr. Whitaker, the chief administrator, Doris trailed off, shaking her head. What happened then? Within days, she was accused of the very thing she was trying to expose. Nobody dared speak up for her. Doris straightened some papers on her desk, her hands trembling slightly. "Listen, dear, be careful asking about this. The administration here, they have ways of dealing with problems." Grace thanked Doris and walked back to her car, her mind racing with this new information. As she started the engine, she glimpsed a black SUV in her rearview mirror, its windows tinted dark. She watched it for a moment, then shook her head, trying to dismiss the surge of unease in her stomach. The late morning sun filtered through the trees as Grace's car wound its way down the narrow dirt road leading to Charles Grant's cabin. Bella and Bruno sat quietly in the back seat, their eyes alert as they watched the unfamiliar landscape pass by. The cabin, when it finally came into view, was a weathered structure with peeling paint and overgrown bushes crowding its foundation. Grace parked and took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The screen door creaked as a tall, thin man with white hair emerged onto the porch. His face was deeply lined, his expression unwelcoming. "What do you want?" Charles Grant's voice was rough with disuse. Grace stepped out of her car, keeping her posture open and friendly. "Mr. Grant, I'm Grace Fletcher. I'd like to talk to you about your daughter, Lila." His face hardened instantly. Nothing to say about her. She made her choices. He turned to go back inside. "Please," Grace called out. "I found her dogs, Bella and Bruno." Charles stopped, his hand on the door handle. Something flickered across his face. Pain, perhaps, or memory. He glanced at the car where the dogs watched through the window. "Those mutts," he muttered, but there was a catch in his voice. She loved them more than anything, spent every spare dollar on their food and care. Grace climbed the porch steps carefully. "Mr. Grant, I'm trying to understand what happened to her. The accusations at the hospital, her disappearance." "Should have kept her head down," Charles interrupted, his voice bitter. "Always had to fight everyone's battles but her own. Ruined everything, her career, her life." He paused, looking out at the trees. "Haven't heard from her since she left. 2 years of silence." Grace waited patiently as Charles seemed lost in thought. Finally he spoke again, his voice softer. "She did come by, right before. Wanted to store some things. Rented a unit at Riverside Storage, over on Mason Street." He turned to Grace, his eyes suddenly sharp. "Leave it alone, Mrs. Fletcher. Nothing good comes from digging up the past." Grace thanked him and made her way back to her car. As she pulled away, she glanced in her rearview mirror. Charles stood on his porch, a lonely figure against the weathered wood. Bella and Bruno pressed their noses against the window, watching the cabin recede into the distance, as if they too could feel the weight of loss that hung over the place. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rows of storage units as Grace pulled into Riverside Storage. Her heart thumped steadily against her ribs as she parked near the back of the facility, where the older units stood in weathered rows. Bella and Bruno waited patiently in the car while she approached Unit 247, the small key from the dog toy clutched tightly in her hand. The lock clicked open smoothly, as if it had been waiting for her. Grace lifted the rolling door, wincing at its metallic groan. The musty smell of closed spaces and forgotten things wafted out. Inside, cardboard boxes were stacked neatly against the walls, and a few pieces of furniture huddled beneath dust covers. Grace switched on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the dimness. She began her search methodically, opening boxes labeled in neat handwriting. Clothes still carried traces of detergent. Books lined with post-it notes spoke of careful study. But it was a medium-sized box marked "Personal" that made her pause. Inside, she found a leather-bound journal, its pages slightly warped from humidity. Grace settled onto an old chair and began to read. Lila's words flowed across the pages, telling a story that made Grace's blood run cold. The entries detailed suspicious activities at the hospital: missing inventory, altered records, unauthorized access to the pharmacy after hours. Lila had documented everything, including names and dates. "Dr. Whitaker signed out morphine again today," one entry read. "Third time this week. Numbers don't match the patient records. When I questioned it, he told me to mind my own business. Something isn't right." Later entries grew more urgent. "They're watching me. Black SUV followed me home again. Called the board of directors, but no one will listen. I have to do something before more patients get hurt." In a folder beneath the journal, Grace found carefully organized documents: photocopied inventory logs, security camera timestamps, personnel schedules. Lila had built a case, piece by piece, against her own colleagues. At the bottom of the box, a stack of photographs made Grace's throat tighten. They showed Lila, young, smiling, full of life, with Bella and Bruno. In one picture, she sat on a park bench, both dogs leaning against her legs, their expressions peaceful and trusting. The same dogs who now waited in Grace's car, survivors of whatever had happened to their beloved owner. As Grace gathered the journal and documents, a car door slammed somewhere in the facility. She quickly closed the storage unit, her movements precise despite her trembling hands. Walking to her car, gravel crunched beneath her feet. Fresh tire tracks cut dark paths through the loose stones near her vehicle, tracks that hadn't been there when she arrived. Grace slipped into the driver's seat, tucking the materials safely into her bag. Bella whined softly from the back seat, and Bruno's ears stood at attention. She started the engine, trying to keep her breathing steady as she drove away from the storage facility, away from the secrets she'd uncovered, and away from whoever might have been watching. The evening settled over Grace's neighborhood like a heavy blanket as she sat in her favorite armchair, Lila's journal open in her lap. Bella and Bruno dozed nearby on their cushions, their gentle breathing a counterpoint to the ticking of the old wall clock. Under the warm glow of her reading lamp, Grace began to immerse herself in Lila's world. The journal entries started professionally enough: observations about medication discrepancies, unusual patterns in the pharmacy logs. But as Grace turned the pages, she felt the growing weight of Lila's isolation. "No one will listen," Lila had written. "They all look away when I try to speak up. Even Sarah, who's been my friend for 5 years, won't meet my eyes anymore." Grace's heart ached as she read about Lila's mounting anxiety. "Dr. Whitaker called me into his office today," one entry stated. "He said he was concerned about my mental health and suggested I take some time off. But I know what I saw. The numbers don't lie. Morphine supplies are disappearing, and his signature is all over the documentation." The documents Grace had found in the storage unit confirmed everything. Spreadsheets showed clear patterns of missing narcotics, all authorized under Dr. Alan Whitaker's supervision. Security logs revealed after-hours access to restricted areas. Everything pointed to a carefully orchestrated operation with Whitaker at its center. A movement caught Grace's eye. She lowered the journal and peered through the living room window. There, parked under a streetlight about 50 yards down the road, sat a black SUV. Its engine was running, evidenced by the faint exhaust visible in the cool night air. Grace's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She moved away from the window and dialed the police, keeping her voice low and steady as she reported the suspicious vehicle. The dispatcher assured her officers would be there shortly. While waiting, Grace turned off all the lights in her house. She stood in the darkness, watching the SUV through a gap in her curtains. After several minutes, the vehicle's headlights came on, and it pulled away from the curb, disappearing around the corner, just as the distant sound of police sirens began to echo through the neighborhood. When the officers arrived, they found no trace of the SUV. They took her statement and promised to increase patrols in the area, but Grace could see the skepticism in their eyes. After they left, she double-checked every lock in the house, testing each window twice. Finally, she gathered Lila's journal and documents, clutching them close as she called Bella and Bruno to follow her upstairs. In her bedroom, she closed and locked the door, drawing comfort from the dog's protective presence as they settled on either side of her bed. Though exhausted, Grace lay awake, holding the journal that contained so many dangerous truths, listening to every small sound in the darkness. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Grace was jolted awake by Bella's distressed whining. The sound was different from anything she'd heard from the gentle dog before, high-pitched and urgent. Grace threw off her covers and hurried downstairs, her heart pounding against her ribs. In the living room, she found Bruno sprawled on his side, his breathing shallow and labored. His eyes were half closed, and he didn't respond when she called his name or gently touched his side. Bella paced anxiously around her companion, occasionally nudging him with her nose. "Oh, no, no, no," Grace whispered, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She quickly dialed Dr. McAllister's emergency number, explaining the situation in rushed, frightened tones. The veterinarian told her to bring Bruno in immediately. Getting Bruno to the car proved challenging. Though he wasn't a large dog, his limp form was awkward to carry. Grace managed to wrap him in a blanket and lift him, her aging muscles protesting the effort. Bella followed close behind, her tail tucked low, whimpering softly. The drive to the clinic was a blur of worry and silent prayers. Grace kept glancing in the rearview mirror, watching Bruno's chest rise and fall with increasingly irregular breaths. Bella sat beside him in the back seat, maintaining her vigil. Dr. McAllister was waiting at the clinic door when Grace pulled up. The vet's team quickly transferred Bruno onto a gurney and whisked him into the examination room. Grace and Bella were left to wait in the sterile reception area, the only sounds being the tick of the wall clock and Bella's occasional whines. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes, Dr. McAllister emerged with a grave expression. She explained that Bruno was suffering from narcotics poisoning, likely a delayed reaction to drugs that had been hidden in or on his body during his time with the traffickers. The substances had somehow remained in his system, perhaps absorbed through his skin or inadvertently ingested. "I should have noticed something was wrong," Grace said, her voice breaking. "I should have brought him in sooner for a full examination." Dr. McAllister squeezed her shoulder. "This isn't your fault, Grace. These types of poisonings can be unpredictable. We're treating him with activated charcoal and supportive care, but the next few hours will be critical." Unable to sit still, Grace decided to take Bella for a short walk around the clinic's grounds. The morning air was cool and damp, and Grace found herself talking to Bella as they walked, sharing her fears and regrets. "We have to make this right," she told the dog, who looked up at her with understanding eyes. "Not just for you and Bruno, but for Lila, too. She tried to stop these people, and look what happened to her. Look what they did to you both." As evening approached, Dr. McAllister finally delivered some good news. Bruno's vital signs were stabilizing. Though he would need to stay at the clinic for observation, the worst seemed to have passed. Exhausted but relieved, Grace gathered Bella's leash and headed home, leaving Bruno in the capable hands of the veterinary staff. The morning light filtered through Grace's kitchen window as she clutched her phone, listening intently to Dr. McAllister's update. Her shoulders relaxed with each positive detail about Bruno's recovery. The veterinarian's voice was warm and reassuring as she explained that Bruno had responded well to treatment and was now stable enough to receive visitors. "He's still weak," Dr. McAllister cautioned, "but he's eating small amounts, and his vital signs are good. You can come see him whenever you're ready." Grace thanked her and hung up, turning to Bella, who sat patiently nearby, her tail thumping against the floor. "Let's take a little drive first, girl. Clear our heads before we visit Bruno." The morning air was crisp as Grace and Bella settled into her old sedan. Bella's head hung out the window slightly, her ears flapping in the breeze as they drove along the outskirts of town, where open fields stretched toward distant hills. The peaceful moment was short-lived. In her rearview mirror, Grace spotted the black SUV she'd seen before, matching her every turn. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she made a sudden right onto a narrow dirt road, hoping to lose their pursuer. Instead of dropping back, the SUV accelerated, its engine roaring as it closed the distance between them. Grace's heart hammered in her chest as the larger vehicle drew alongside her car. Bella began barking frantically as the SUV swerved toward them, forcing Grace to veer onto the shoulder. Gravel pinged against her car's undercarriage as she fought to maintain control. Through sheer instinct, Grace spotted a gas station ahead and yanked the wheel hard, cutting across the opposite lane to reach the safety of the brightly lit forecourt. The SUV's brake lights flashed briefly before it sped away, disappearing around a bend in the road. Her hands trembling, Grace pulled out her phone and dialed 911. When the police arrived, they took her statement with professional detachment. Without witnesses or security camera footage from the rural road, they explained there wasn't much they could do beyond filing a report. "Maybe it was just some kid playing pranks," one officer suggested, his tone dismissive. "We'll keep an eye out for suspicious vehicles in the area." Frustrated and scared, Grace drove home with Bella pressed close to her side in the passenger seat. Once inside, she methodically checked every lock, drew all the curtains, and sank into her armchair. The morning's events had left her shaken, but as she watched Bella settle protectively at her feet, she knew she couldn't give up. Someone had tried to frighten her away from the investigation, which only convinced her she was getting closer to the truth. Grace helped Bruno out of her car, supporting his wobbly legs as he made his way up the front steps. Though still weak from his ordeal, his tail wagged at the sight of home. Bella danced around them anxiously, whining softly until Bruno was settled on his bed in the living room. "Easy now, girl," Grace murmured, watching as Bella curled up next to Bruno, resting her head protectively over his back. The gesture brought tears to Grace's eyes. Despite everything they'd been through, their bond remained unshakable. Throughout the morning, Bella barely left Bruno's side, getting up only to fetch water or check the windows when a car passed by. Grace noticed how Bella would nudge Bruno gently whenever he seemed uncomfortable, helping him adjust his position or offering quiet comfort with a gentle lick. Their devotion to each other stirred something deep in Grace's heart. If these dogs could remain so loyal and brave after all their suffering, surely she could find the courage to continue her investigation, despite the threats and intimidation. By early afternoon, Karen arrived with tools and equipment to help secure the house. Together, they installed new deadbolts on all the doors and a sophisticated security camera system that would alert Grace's phone if anyone approached the house. "These cameras have night vision," Karen explained, adjusting the angle of one unit. "Nobody's going to sneak up on you now." Grace spent the rest of the afternoon organizing the evidence she'd gathered. She carefully photographed each document from Lila's storage unit, saving digital copies to multiple secure locations. The originals went into a lockbox she could quickly grab if needed. As she flipped through Lila's journal one more time, a loose paper fluttered to the floor. Grace picked it up, recognizing Lila's neat handwriting. The answer is in the safe place. She read the words several times, wondering what Lila had considered safe. The note suggested there was more evidence out there, waiting to be found. That night, as Grace prepared for bed, she paused to watch Bella and Bruno sleeping peacefully together. Bella's head still rested protectively over Bruno's back, their breathing synchronized in sleep. Grace knelt beside them, gently stroking their fur. "We're going to figure this out," she whispered to them. "I promise you both we'll see this through to the end, no matter what it takes." Grace sat at her kitchen table early the next morning, surrounded by papers and documents. Sunlight streamed through the window as she methodically reviewed Lila's journal entries again, looking for any clues she might have missed. Bella and Bruno dozed nearby, their peaceful presence helping her focus. "The answer is in the safe place," Grace muttered, tapping her pen against the journal. The phrase kept drawing her attention. Something about it nagged at her mind, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. She closed her eyes, thinking about everything she knew about Lila's time at the hospital. Suddenly, Grace's eyes snapped open. Of course, Lila had worked directly with the hospital administrator before being dismissed. She would have had access to the administrative offices, including the filing systems. What better place to hide evidence than right under their noses? After making sure Bella and Bruno had fresh water and comfortable beds, Grace grabbed her purse and headed to the hospital. She had carefully chosen her outfit, a conservative sweater and slacks that would help her blend in with the daily visitors and staff. At the hospital, Grace found Doris at the nurse's station, just as she'd hoped. "I wanted to thank you again for all your help the other day," Grace said warmly, engaging the nurse in conversation. They chatted about the hospital's history and recent changes, giving Grace the opportunity to observe the hallway leading to the administrative wing. When Doris was called away to help a patient, Grace seized her chance. She walked purposefully down the corridor, nodding to passing staff members as if she belonged there. Her heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral and calm. The administrative wing was quiet, with most offices dark and empty. Grace slipped into the main office area, scanning the room quickly. In a corner, partially hidden behind a large plant, stood an old metal filing cabinet. Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled out the small key from her pocket. The key slid into the lock perfectly, turning with a soft click. Inside the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of ordinary paperwork, Grace found what she was looking for: a USB drive labeled Whitaker Files, and a folder containing what appeared to be detailed records of drug transactions. Working quickly and methodically, Grace used her phone to photograph each document, making sure to capture every detail. She carefully returned everything to its exact position, relocking the cabinet. The USB drive, small enough to fit in her coin purse, would be impossible to miss if she left it behind. As Grace made her way back through the hospital corridors, her outward composure masked her racing thoughts. She had found what Lila had hidden: proof of Dr. Whitaker's involvement in the drug trafficking ring. But now that she had the evidence, she felt the weight of its implications pressing down on her shoulders. The morning sun filtered through Grace's home office window as she sat at her desk, methodically reviewing the evidence she'd gathered. Her hands trembled slightly as she plugged the USB drive into her laptop. The screen filled with folders containing emails, spreadsheets, and internal memos, all painting a clear picture of Dr. Whitaker's involvement in the hospital's drug trafficking operation. "Oh, Lila," Grace whispered, her heart heavy as she read through detailed records of missing narcotics and falsified inventory reports. The documents revealed a sophisticated scheme orchestrated by Dr. Whitaker and other hospital executives. They had been systematically stealing drugs from the hospital's supplies and selling them through an underground network. Financial records showed large deposits to offshore accounts, carefully disguised as legitimate business transactions. Internal memos exposed how whistleblowers were systematically silenced through threats and false accusations. Grace's throat tightened as she found an email thread discussing Lila's problem and the need to handle it permanently. As Grace organized the files into clear categories of evidence, she noticed a change in Bella and Bruno's behavior. The dogs, usually content to doze nearby, began pacing restlessly by the front door. Their ears perked up, and low growls rumbled in their throats. The familiar sound of an engine caught Grace's attention. Her stomach dropped as she peeked through the curtains and saw the black SUV parked across the street. A tall man in a dark suit emerged, his movements purposeful and threatening as he strode toward her house. The sharp knock on her door made Grace jump. Bella and Bruno's barking exploded through the house, fierce and protective. "Ms. Fletcher," the man's voice carried through the door, cold and demanding. "We know you have documents that don't belong to you. Hand them over now, and this ends quietly." Grace's heart hammered in her chest, but her voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're talking about. Please leave my property." "Don't play games," he snarled. "Dr. Whitaker knows what you took. Give us the evidence, or you'll regret it." Grace stepped back from the door, drawing strength from Bella and Bruno's protective presence. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police." The door handle rattled violently as the man tried to force his way in. Bella and Bruno lunged forward, their barking reaching a frenzied pitch. Through the window, Grace could see the man hesitate, clearly unnerved by the dog's aggression. "This isn't over," he spat, backing away from the door. Grace watched through the window as he returned to the SUV and drove away, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone to search for the contact information of Sarah Chen, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. The night wrapped around Grace's small home like a protective blanket as she methodically arranged the evidence at her dining room table. Her fingers moved swiftly, organizing papers into clear plastic folders while copying the USB drive's contents onto multiple backup drives. Bella and Bruno lay at her feet, their warm presence offering silent comfort in the quiet house. "We're almost there," Grace murmured to the dogs, pausing to scratch behind Bruno's ears. His tail thumped softly against the floor, but his eyes remained alert, scanning the windows. Bella pressed closer to Grace's legs as if trying to shield her from unseen dangers. Grace checked her watch, 11:30 p.m. She had arranged to meet Sarah Chen, the investigative journalist, at Dawn Creek Park at 6 a.m. The early hour would mean fewer people around, but the open space would make it harder for anyone to approach without being seen. As she sealed the final envelope, her hands trembled slightly. The weight of Lila's truth pressed heavily on her shoulders. The documents and USB drive contained enough evidence to expose years of corruption and potentially dangerous people. Grace tucked everything into her worn leather messenger bag, then double-checked the locks on all doors and windows. The sky was still dark when Grace woke at 5 a.m. She moved quietly through her morning routine, Bella and Bruno following her every step. Their usual breakfast excitement was replaced by an almost solemn attention, as if they understood the gravity of the day ahead. The drive to Dawn Creek Park was tense, but uneventful. Grace parked near the playground, where early morning joggers occasionally passed by. Bella and Bruno sat alert in the back seat, their eyes scanning the surroundings. The familiar black SUV appeared like a shadow, sliding into position behind Grace's car. Her heart jumped into her throat as she recognized the driver, the same man who had threatened her at her house. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 other men emerged from the vehicle, their intentions clear in their purposeful stride. "Hand over the evidence, Ms. Fletcher," the driver called out, his voice carrying across the empty parking lot. "No one needs to get hurt." Grace's fingers tightened around her bag as the men approached. Suddenly, Bella and Bruno exploded into action. Bruno launched himself toward the nearest man, his usually gentle demeanor transformed into fierce protection. His teeth snapped dangerously close to the man's leg, forcing him to stumble backward. Bella targeted the driver, her smaller size belying her effectiveness as she clamped onto his wrist. The man howled in pain, dropping something that clattered to the pavement. Grace seized her chance. Clutching her bag tightly, she sprinted toward a young family setting up for an early morning picnic. "Help!" she shouted, her voice carrying across the park. "Call the police!" The afternoon sun filtered through the windows of the small coffee shop on the outskirts of town, where Grace had arranged to meet Rebecca Miles. She'd chosen this location carefully, a family-owned establishment with security cameras and plenty of foot traffic, but quiet enough for a private conversation. Bella and Bruno waited patiently in her car, parked where she could see them through the window. Rebecca Miles carried herself with quiet confidence, her sharp eyes taking in every detail as she slid into the booth across from Grace. Her reputation for exposing corruption preceded her, and Grace felt a flutter of relief at finally sharing her burden with someone who could help. "I've brought everything," Grace said softly, sliding her messenger bag beneath the table to pass it discreetly to Rebecca. Her hands trembled slightly as she explained the story, starting with finding the vial in Bella's fur and ending with the confrontation at the park that morning. Rebecca listened intently, taking careful notes as Grace detailed Dr. Whitaker's involvement in the drug trafficking ring and Lila's desperate attempts to expose the truth. When Grace described the threats and intimidation she'd faced, Rebecca's expression hardened with determination. "This is exactly the kind of story that needs to be told," Rebecca assured her, carefully examining the USB drive and documents. She spent several minutes scanning through Lila's journal, her eyebrows rising as she read. "The paper trail here is incredible. Dr. Whitaker and his associates weren't as careful as they thought." Rebecca pulled out her phone and began making calls to her contacts, speaking in low, urgent tones. Grace watched as the journalist's network of sources quickly confirmed various pieces of information from the documents. "Your identity will be completely protected," Rebecca promised, tucking the evidence securely into her own bag. "We'll present this as the result of a months-long investigation. No one will know about your involvement." Grace felt tears of relief prick at her eyes. After weeks of carrying this weight alone, knowing that justice would finally be served for Lila and for Bella and Bruno, lifted an enormous burden from her shoulders. "The story will break within days," Rebecca explained, her voice firm with conviction. "I'm contacting my sources in law enforcement right now. They'll want to move quickly once they see this evidence." As Grace stood to leave, Rebecca touched her arm gently. "You've done the right thing," she said softly. "Lila would be grateful." Grace walked to her car, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Bella and Bruno greeted her with gentle tail wags, and she smiled at them through the window. For the first time since this journey began, she felt real hope blooming in her chest. The morning light streamed through Grace's kitchen window as she sat at her computer, hands trembling as she clicked on the breaking news headline. Rebecca's exposé filled the screen, complete with damning evidence and carefully documented proof of the hospital's drug trafficking operation. The story detailed years of corruption, with Dr. Whitaker at the center of it all. Grace read through the article twice, her heart pounding. Rebecca had masterfully woven together the evidence, protecting Grace's identity while ensuring every accusation was backed by solid proof. The public response was immediate and fierce. Social media exploded with outrage, and local news stations picked up the story within hours. Around noon, Grace settled onto her couch. Bella and Bruno curled up beside her as she watched the live news coverage. Police cars surrounded the hospital, their lights flashing against the building's sterile walls. Officers led Dr. Whitaker out in handcuffs, his face ashen as reporters shouted questions. More arrests followed. Administrators, executives, and others involved in the trafficking ring were escorted to waiting patrol cars. The news anchor's voice was steady as she reported, "Anonymous sources provided extensive documentation of the drug trafficking operation, leading to today's arrests. Among the evidence were records indicating that nurse Lila Grant, previously accused of drug theft, had actually attempted to expose the operation before her disappearance 2 years ago." Grace's phone rang. It was Rebecca. "The story's impact is even bigger than we anticipated," the journalist said, her voice warm with satisfaction. "The district attorney is already talking about a full investigation into the hospital's administration. And Grace, they're officially clearing Lila's name. Her father has been notified, and the hospital board is issuing a formal apology for their role in discrediting her." Tears rolled down Grace's cheeks as she listened to Rebecca describe how Lila's courage was finally being recognized. The truth had come to light, just as Lila had fought for. The journalist thanked Grace again for her bravery in bringing forward the evidence, assuring her that her identity remained protected. After hanging up, Grace looked down at Bella and Bruno, who dozed peacefully at her feet. Bruno had fully recovered from his recent health scare, and both dogs seemed more relaxed than ever before. She reached down to stroke their fur, remembering how they had protected her when she needed them most. These loyal companions had been more than just rescued dogs. They had been the key to unlocking the truth and bringing justice for Lila. The morning sun cast long shadows across the veterinary clinic's parking lot as Grace helped Bella and Bruno out of her car. The cool autumn breeze ruffled their fur, and Bruno's tail wagged with newfound energy, a stark contrast to his condition just days ago. Dr. McAllister greeted them warmly at the entrance, her face brightening at the sight of the two dogs trotting beside Grace. "Look at you both," Dr. McAllister said, kneeling to examine Bruno more closely. "Such a difference from when I first saw you." She led them into the examination room, where she carefully checked Bruno's vital signs and responses. Grace watched anxiously as the vet conducted her examination, but her worry soon melted into relief. Dr. McAllister's smile grew wider with each test. "His recovery is remarkable," she announced, scratching behind Bruno's ears. "His blood work has normalized, and his energy levels are exactly where they should be." Bella stayed close to Bruno throughout the examination, occasionally nudging him with her nose, as if checking on him herself. Dr. McAllister noticed their interaction and smiled. "Their bond is extraordinary," she observed. "It's likely what helped them survive their ordeal before coming to the shelter." As Dr. McAllister updated Bruno's medical records, Grace found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them all together. These dogs, who had arrived at the shelter so broken and afraid, had shown incredible courage. They had protected her when she needed them most, and their resilience had given her the strength to see through the investigation that cleared Lila's name. "You know," Dr. McAllister said, breaking into Grace's thoughts, "they may still show signs of their past trauma. Loud noises might startle them, or certain situations might trigger anxiety. But with the love and stability you're providing, they'll continue to heal." After the appointment, Grace took the dogs to the nearby park. The autumn leaves crunched beneath their paws as they walked along the path. Bruno moved with a spring in his step that had been absent during his illness, stopping occasionally to investigate interesting scents. Bella remained vigilant but relaxed, her protective nature now tempered with growing confidence. As they rounded the park's walking trail, Grace noticed how Bruno's tail wagged continuously, his eyes bright with joy. Bella matched his pace, their shoulders occasionally brushing against each other as they walked. The sight filled Grace's heart with warmth, knowing that they had all emerged stronger from their shared ordeal. Their journey together had transformed not just the dogs, but Grace herself, showing her depths of courage she hadn't known she possessed. The autumn morning held a special warmth as Grace walked through the shelter doors one last time. Karen greeted her with a bright smile and a thick folder of adoption papers. The familiar sounds and scents of the shelter brought back memories of that first day when she'd met Bella and Bruno, two frightened souls destined for euthanasia. Now, they waited patiently beside her, their tails wagging gently as Karen approached. "I never would have guessed this outcome when I first asked you to volunteer," Karen said, spreading the adoption papers across the counter. "You've given them such a wonderful second chance." Grace's hand trembled slightly as she signed each document, the weight of the moment settling over her. Each signature felt like a promise, a commitment to protect and cherish these remarkable dogs who had changed her life so profoundly. Bella pressed against her leg while Bruno watched the proceedings with alert eyes. Back home, Grace threw herself into creating the perfect space for her new family members. She rearranged the living room furniture, creating a cozy corner near the window where sunlight streamed in during the afternoon. She laid out their favorite blankets, the soft blue one Bruno preferred and the plush gray one Bella always chose for napping. Opening a package that had arrived that morning, Grace held up two gleaming metal tags. She'd ordered them specially engraved with their names and her address. The tags caught the light, reminding her how far they'd come from the matted, scared dogs she'd first encountered. As she attached the tags to their collars, she felt tears welling up in her eyes. Later that afternoon, Grace settled at her desk with a new leather-bound journal. The blank pages seemed to invite her to preserve the extraordinary events that had brought them together. She began writing about that first day at the shelter, about discovering the vial in Bella's fur, and about their role in bringing justice to Lila's memory. As she wrote, Grace found herself describing not just the events, but the profound impact Bella and Bruno had on her life. She detailed their gradual transformation from frightened, abused animals to loyal, loving companions. Their journey had taught her about courage, resilience, and the healing power of love. The afternoon light began to fade as Grace finished writing. She moved to the couch, where Bella immediately settled at her feet, her warm presence comforting and familiar. Bruno followed, resting his head on Grace's lap with a contented sigh. She ran her fingers through his fur, noting how healthy and glossy it had become. Sitting there with her dogs, Grace felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. The quiet moments like these, filled with simple companionship and trust, were precious beyond measure. She had given Bella and Bruno a home, but they had given her so much more: purpose, courage, and unconditional love. Grace navigated her car down the familiar dirt road leading to Charles Grant's cabin, the morning sun filtering through the trees. Bella and Bruno sat quietly in the back seat, their presence giving her strength for what she knew would be an emotional conversation. The cabin looked different in the morning light, less forbidding than during her first visit, though still weathered and lonely. As she parked, Charles emerged onto his front porch, his face a mix of surprise and wariness. He watched as Grace helped Bella and Bruno out of the car, his eyes lingering on the dogs he'd only heard about before. "Mr. Grant," Grace called out gently, "I have some news about Lila that I think you should hear." Charles's shoulders stiffened at the mention of his daughter's name, but he nodded slowly and gestured toward the porch chairs. "Might as well come up and sit," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Inside her bag, Grace carried the newspaper articles about the hospital investigation and the photo she'd found in the storage unit. As they settled into the chairs, Bella and Bruno lay down nearby, their presence somehow making the moment less tense. "The truth about Lila has come out," Grace began, carefully explaining the investigation, the evidence, and how Lila's accusations had been proven correct. She watched as Charles's weathered face transformed with each revelation, his hands trembling as he read the newspaper headlines. When Grace showed him the photographs of Lila with Bella and Bruno, Charles's tough exterior finally cracked. Tears welled in his eyes as he traced his daughter's smiling face with a trembling finger. "She looks so happy here," he whispered, studying the image of Lila hugging the dogs. "I was wrong about her," Charles admitted, his voice breaking. "I believed what they said at the hospital. I should have known better, should have trusted my own daughter." He wiped roughly at his eyes with the back of his hand. "She was always the brave one, just like her mother." Grace gently placed her hand on his arm. Lila's actions helped expose a dangerous drug ring and probably saved many lives. Her legacy is one of courage and integrity. Charles looked at Bella and Bruno, who had moved closer during their conversation. "These dogs, they were with her at the end?" When Grace nodded, he asked hesitantly, "Would it be all right if I visited them sometimes? They're all I have left of her now." "Of course," Grace replied warmly. "They'd like that." As Grace prepared to leave, Charles stood on his porch, looking more at peace than she'd ever seen him. "Thank you," he said simply, watching as Bella and Bruno climbed into the car. A small smile broke through his grief as he raised his hand in farewell, the morning sun warming his face. The community center buzzed with anticipation as Grace adjusted her simple blue dress, feeling slightly out of place among the crowd gathering for the whistleblower recognition ceremony. Bella and Bruno sat calmly at her feet, their coats gleaming after their recent grooming. The local newspaper had arranged the event following Rebecca Miles's explosive exposé, which had sparked widespread reforms at the hospital and renewed interest in patient advocacy. Grace watched as people filed into their seats, many stopping to admire Bella and Bruno. The dogs had become minor celebrities since the story broke, their journey from abandoned victims to key players in exposing corruption touching many hearts. Bruno's tail wagged gently as children waved at him, while Bella maintained her characteristic protective stance, though her eyes were softer now. When it was Grace's turn to speak, she approached the podium with Bella and Bruno at her side. Her voice trembled slightly as she began, but grew stronger as she shared their story. "These dogs," she said, gesturing to her faithful companions, "led me to uncover not just corruption, but also the incredible courage of a woman named Lila Grant. She gave everything to protect others, and these beautiful creatures helped bring her truth to light." The audience listened intently as Grace described finding the vial in Bella's fur, the discovery of Lila's journal, and the dangerous pursuit of justice that followed. Bella and Bruno sat perfectly still throughout her speech, as if understanding the gravity of the moment. After the formal presentations, people gathered around Grace and the dogs. A young woman in the hospital scrubs approached, her eyes brimming with tears. "I was a patient here 2 years ago," she shared quietly. "Things happened that I knew weren't right, but I felt so powerless. Hearing about Lila's courage and seeing these dogs who helped expose the truth, it gives me hope that speaking up matters." Others shared similar stories, each one reinforcing the ripple effect of their journey. Children asked to pet the dogs, and Bella and Bruno responded with gentle patience, their transformation from frightened rescue dogs to beloved heroes complete. A local veterinary clinic announced they would establish a fund in Bella and Bruno's names to help abused animals, while the hospital's new administration pledged to create stronger whistleblower protections in Lila's memory. As the event drew to a close, Grace felt overwhelmed by the impact their story had made. She walked toward the exit with Bella and Bruno by her side, their steady presence grounding her amid the emotion of the day. Grace's garden bloomed with late summer flowers, their vibrant colors painting her small backyard in cheerful hues. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass as she knelt among her beloved plants, pruning and weeding with practiced care. Nearby, Bella and Bruno romped in their designated play area, their playful barks filling the air with joy. The dogs had developed a morning routine of their own. Bruno would chase butterflies, his once timid demeanor replaced by gentle curiosity, while Bella alternated between playing with her brother and checking on Grace. Their transformation from frightened shelter dogs to confident, happy pets never ceased to amaze her. Inside, Grace had converted her spare room into a cozy reading nook, complete with a large cushioned window seat where the dogs could curl up beside her. Their favorite spot was beneath the window, where sunlight streamed in during the afternoon hours. Photographs lined the walls, some of Bella and Bruno's progress, others from the whistleblower ceremony, and a special corner dedicated to Lila's memory. One peaceful evening, as Grace settled into her favorite armchair with a cup of chamomile tea, she watched Bella and Bruno dozing on their plush beds nearby. Their breathing was deep and content, so different from the anxious panting that had characterized their first nights in her home. Bruno's coat now gleamed with health, and Bella's eyes had lost their haunted look, replaced by a serene trust that touched Grace's heart. She reached for her journal, its pages filled with their shared journey. As she wrote about their day, Grace reflected on how far they'd all come. The frightened dogs from the shelter had become her closest companions, their resilience inspiring her to find courage she never knew she possessed. Together, they had not only uncovered the truth about the hospital's corruption, but had also helped restore Lila's reputation and bring justice to those who had silenced her. The setting sun painted the living room in warm hues as Grace closed her journal. She moved to the porch, bringing her tea along, and settled into the wooden rocking chair. Bella and Bruno followed, taking their usual spots near her feet. The yard stretched before them, peaceful in the golden light of dusk. As she watched the dogs play in the yard, their tails wagging with pure joy, Grace felt a profound sense of contentment wash over her. "We made it," she whispered to her furry companions. They turned at the sound of her voice, their tails wagging in happy agreement as if acknowledging the beautiful life they now shared. If you enjoyed the story of Grace, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.